I have sometimes marvelled that certain of the most singular experiences which befell Sherlock Holmes should have remained unknown to the wider public.
Among these there was one affair connected with a lonely fen and a mechanical device for catching the human voice which, for reasons that will presently appear, I did not see fit to publish until many years after the principal actors were past the reach of earthly opinion. It was in the early 90s that this curious episode occurred, at a time when Holmes and I still occupied our old quarters in Baker Street and the world was only beginning to busy itself with ingenious contrivances for the capturing and reproducing of sound. The morning upon which the matter was brought to us was of the dreariest London type, with a thin rain drifting against the window panes and the street outside lying in a grey blur of smoke and moisture. Holmes was curled in his armchair, his long, thin figure coiled like some great cat, while his eyes, half closed, rested upon the columns of the Times which drooped from his nervous fingers. For myself, I had been engaged upon some notes of our recent little success in the Camberwell poisoning case, when a knock upon the door and the well-known tread of our landlady announced a visitor.
"A lady to see you, sir, and very much distressed she seems."
Pray show her in, Mrs. Hudson.
Our landlady withdrew and returned a moment later, ushering in a young woman whose aspect at once arrested my professional attention no less than my human sympathy. She was of that gentle, self-contained type which one so often finds among English women who earn their bread by honourable labour, and yet the pallor of her face, the reddened lids, and the tight clasp of her gloved hands told of suffering bravely borne.
"My name is Margaret Reed, gentleman, and I have been given to understand that you're the one man in London to whom I may turn in my extremity."
You do us honour, Miss Reed, and we shall endeavour to be worthy of your confidence. Pray be seated, and let us have your story as clearly as you can give it, for it is upon precision of detail that the fate of many a case has turned.
She sank into the chair which I placed for her, and for an instant covered her face as if to collect herself before she began.
"I am a governess by profession, Dr. Watson, and for the last 2 years I have had charge of the children of Colonel Harwood at a place called High Gables in Surrey. It was there that I met Mr. Alastair Forbes, who was engaged as a land surveyor upon a great drainage scheme in the eastern counties, a wild tract of marsh and bog which they call Blackmere Fen. Mr. Forbes is, or was, a man of much energy and high spirits, and he did me the honour to offer me his hand, which after some months of acquaintance I consented to accept. We became engaged, with the full approval of my employers, and he spoke often and lovingly of the time when his work upon the fen should be complete, and he might claim me for his wife."
Here her voice faltered for an instant, and her hands tightened upon the small parcel which she held upon her lap.
3 weeks ago I received from him a brief note, written in haste, which told me that affairs in connection with the Blackmere scheme required his presence night and day upon the works, and that for a little while I must not look for letters from him. I was disturbed, yet I trusted him, and I waited as he bade me. Then, 10 days ago, there came by post this box which you see, and which I was told contained a new kind of machine which Mr. Forbes had begun to use in his work.
With trembling fingers she unfastened the straps of the parcel and disclosed a small case of polished wood fitted with a horn, a crank, and a wax cylinder clamped upon a central spindle. I had seen such an instrument once before in a medical lecture room, and recognised it as one of those experimental phonographs which certain men of science and of business had lately begun to employ.
There was a slip of paper inside, upon which was written in a hand that resembled that of Mr. Forbes, that I was to set the handle thus and release this catch, and that I should then hear his own voice explaining that which he could not bring himself to write. I did as I was directed, and presently I heard a voice which I believed to be his, yet which spoke words that froze my very blood.
She drew from her reticule the small wax cylinder and held it out with a shudder of repulsion, as one might handle some venomous thing.
The voice said that he had been mistaken in our engagement, and had come to see that he was unfitted for the life which lay before him, that his prospects in England were ruined, that he was leaving at once for a distant colony, and that I must forget him, and think of him only as one who is dead. He begged that I would not seek to see him again, and he added certain conventional phrases of regret, which were utterly unlike the man whom I had known. There were no words of endearment, no allusion to those small memories which had been so dear between us. I can't say why, gentlemen, but though the voice was marvellously like his, I felt in my heart that it was not he who spoke.
Holmes, who had been listening with his eyes closed and his fingers pressed together before him, now leaned forward with quickened interest.
You formed that impression at once, Miss Reed, or only after reflection?
It was at once, sir, and it has not left me since. I could not reconcile that cold, formal message with the man who had parted from me so lately in all kindness and honour.
You did not, however, regard the matter as closed.
No, indeed I did not, for 3 days later I saw in London a man whom I took to be Mr. Forbes himself.
At this singular statement, Holmes shot a swift glance at me and then back at our visitor.
Pray give us the circumstances of that sighting with the greatest exactitude.
I had been given a brief holiday, and had come up to town upon some small purchases, and as I walked along a street in Bloomsbury I saw before me a gentleman alight from a hansom and assist a lady to descend. He turned his face a little as he paid the driver, and though he wore a heavy travelling coat, and his hat was pressed low upon his brow, I believed that I recognised Mr. Forbes. I ran forward, crying his name, but he started as if he had been struck, turned his face more fully towards me for an instant, then said that I was mistaken, and almost dragged the lady within the door of a lodging-house which stood there. The door was at once closed, and I was left in the street with my heart beating so that I could scarce stand. I asked a passer-by whose house it was, and was told that it was a respectable lodging kept by a Mrs. Hargreaves, but I had not the courage to knock and make further inquiries. I came away half-stunned, torn between the cruel message of the machine and the glimpse of a face that seemed my lover's and yet denied me.
She spoke these last words in such agitation that I feared she would break down, but by a great effort she mastered herself and sat silent, her eyes fixed upon Holmes.
You have done wisely to come to me, Miss Reed, for you are confronted with an appearance of inconsistency, which must be resolved if your peace of mind is ever to be restored. Tell me now something of Mr. Forbes's position and connections, and of any associates he may have had in this drainage scheme upon the Fen.
He was employed by a firm of engineers in the city, but during the last year he had been almost entirely resident at the works in the village of Tilford, which is upon the edge of Blackmere Fen. He wrote often of his colleague, Mr. John Wilcox, who had charge of the financial side of the undertaking, and who, I fear, had once conceived some feeling for me before he understood that Mr. Forbes and I were engaged. Mr. Wilcox came more than once to High Gables, and I could not but see that he regarded Mr. Forbes with a certain constrained admiration which, to a woman's eye, seemed to hide some bitterness beneath it. When I received the message of our parting, I wrote at once to Mr. Wilcox, begging him to tell me frankly what had befallen Mr. Forbes, but I have had from him only a short reply saying that my former fiancé had left England suddenly, and that he could add nothing to the explanation, which I had already received from the phonograph.
You have the letter?
Yes, I have brought it with me.
She handed a folded sheet across the table, and Holmes, spreading it out, examined the few cold sentences with eyes that seemed to drink in each stroke of the pen.
The hand is firm and rather characterless, Watson, and the writer is a man who has taught himself to conceal emotion in his written communications. You perceive that he speaks of Mr. Forbes by his surname only, and that there is not a single word of sympathy for your distress, Miss Reed, which one would surely look for from a generous nature. You say that Mr. Wilcox had once shown you some attention.
It was so, sir, and I had feared that my refusal might have given him pain, but he protested at the time that he bore me no ill will.
And yet it is upon him that you now depend for intelligence as to the fate of the man whom you accepted in his stead.
It is a hard position, sir, and it is because I dare not trust his word that I have ventured to come to you.
You did perfectly right. One more question before I examine this ingenious little instrument which has played so sinister a part in your story. Had Mr. Forbes ever spoken to you of the use of such a device for his professional labours?
He had said that Mr. Wilcox was greatly interested in new inventions of all kinds, and that he had persuaded him to dictate some notes upon the work upon the Fen in order that they might later be set out in order. He laughed when he wrote of it, and said that it made him feel foolish to talk at a brass horn, as he called it, but that it amused Mr. Wilcox.
Very good. You may rely, Miss Reed, that we shall look closely into this matter. Dr. Watson and I will visit Blackmere Fen without delay, and we shall also give our attention to the lodging house in Bloomsbury at which you believe you saw your fiancé. In the meantime, you would do well to return to your duties at High Gables and to hold yourself at our disposal should we desire any further information.
I can never thank you enough, Mr. Holmes, but I shall obey you in all things and await your pleasure.
Holmes rose, bowed with that grave courtesy which he could assume at will, and stood for a moment lost in thought when the door had closed behind our visitor.
You observed, Watson, that the lady's instinct rebelled at the message while her reason was almost compelled to accept it.
I did indeed, and I confess that my own mind is much disturbed by the story.
It is the misfortune of the plain man, my dear fellow, that he will always allow his judgment to be bullied by any new piece of mechanism which presents itself with an air of authority. Because a box whirs and a needle dances and some cracked simulacrum of a human voice issues from a trumpet, he will readily grant it the credit of veracity.
You would imply that the message was not from Forbes.
I imply that the message was produced by a human being who may or may not have been Forbes, and that every probability points to the latter alternative. Note the studied coldness of the phrases, the absence of those small and intimate allusions which a lover could scarcely forbear even when he desired to be firm, and above all the fact that the lady who knows his voice best doubts the authenticity of the tones.
Yet the likeness might be very close.
We shall soon know how close. Kindly hand me the instrument, Watson.
I placed a phonograph upon the table, and Holmes bent over it, his thin fingers exploring its screws and fittings with a swift and delicate touch that reminded me of a surgeon's hand upon some strange, new organ.
As I thought, it is of the newer pattern, and the wax cylinder is of good quality, capable of preserving very minute inflections of the voice. There is no reason why a tolerable mimic might not deceive a casual hearer, but there are certain small peculiarities of articulation which no imitator can entirely reproduce. Let us hear what our absent friend has to say for himself.
He wound the handle with a few rapid turns, set the mechanism in motion, and presently there came forth from the horn a thin, metallic voice which spoke in short, jerky sentences.
My prospects in this country are blasted, and I have resolved to seek a new life beyond the seas. I must ask you to release me from all that has passed between us and to think of me only as one who's dead. Your kindness will not be forgotten, but I am not the man to make you happy, and it is best that we should part forever.
The message, which ran to no great length, ceased with a faint whir of the machine, and Holmes remained motionless for some seconds after the last syllable had died away.
Very crude, Watson, and yet sufficiently cunning for the purpose in hand.
In what respect crude?
Consider the phrasing. The expression about blasted prospects is a melodramatic touch more likely to come from a resentful subordinate than from a man of active affairs. Again, note the absence of any local colour. Our correspondent does not so much as mention the fen, the work, the partners, or any circumstance which has lately engaged his existence. Such omissions are not natural in a sincere farewell.
You would read in it then the hand of Mr. Wilcox.
I read the hand of someone who has listened long to Forbes and has learned something of his manner, yet whose own gloomy habit of speech colours every sentence. I also note a slight hesitation before the word to which he alluded as the blasted prospects, as though the speaker feared to betray his own habitual turn. But our conjectures will be better founded when we have seen the ground upon which the drama has been played. Pack your bag, Watson, and send Mrs. Hudson for a cab, for we take the afternoon train to the eastern counties.
Within 2 hours we were rattling out of the Liverpool Street terminus, Holmes stretched at length upon the seat with his eyes closed and his hands thrust deep into his pockets, while I watched the dingy outskirts of London give place to the trim hedgerows and flat, damp meadows of the lower country. As we drew nearer to our destination, the land grew wilder, with broad fields of rushes and rank grasses, and here and there a glimmer of black water among the sedges. At last the train drew up at a little wayside station, where a raw wind came sweeping over the level, and a thin drizzle drove beneath the wooden awning.
A short, wiry man in a bowler hat and a comforter stood upon the platform with his hands in his pockets and his sharp features set in their accustomed mask of official importance.
Well, Mr. Holmes, I am glad to see that the country has not lost its attractions for you.
And I, my dear Lestrade, am delighted to find that the gravity of the case has brought down so distinguished a representative of Scotland Yard.
Gravity is perhaps more than the local authorities would admit, but there have been some queer doings out at Blackmere Fen, and the county magistrate thought it well that I should look in. When I heard that you were upon the way, I felt that things might move a trifle faster.
You have had some mishap at the works.
One of the labouring fellows has gone off without a word, and there are marks by the marsh edge that look ugly to a man who has seen as many rough jobs as I have. Still, men do disappear after a row and a drinking bout, and there is nothing so far that I can put before a jury.
You have, however, the disappearance of Mr. Alistair Forbes to add to your dossier.
Forbes? Why, he is the very man whose absence set the whole village talking, but I had it from his friend and partner, Mr. Wilcox, that he had gone abroad on business of his own.
You have seen Wilcox?
I have spoken with him, and he gave me a straight enough story in my opinion, though he is a close one and not over fond of questions.
We shall have some questions for him notwithstanding. How far is it to Tilford?
A couple of miles by trap, and I have one waiting.
We were soon jolting along a narrow road, with flat fields stretching away on either side, and the line of the fen lying like a low dark cloud upon the horizon.
The air grew rawer as we approached it, and a faint, sour smell of stagnant water came upon the wind. Presently, the houses of Tilford, a straggling village of red brick, and where the timber appeared before us, and beyond them, dim and sinister under the lowering sky, lay the great expanse of Blackmere Fen. At the inn, which bore the sign of the drowned sailor, we were shown into a low, sanded parlour, where a fire of peat smoked upon the hearth, and a gaunt, elderly landlord rose from behind the bar to receive us.
You will be the gentleman from London, I make no doubt, and the room is ready as you ordered, sir.
These gentlemen are with me upon a matter which is not for the public ear at present. We shall desire a word with you later, Mr. Kemp, upon the movements of your guests during the last week or two.
You shall have any information that a respectable house can give, sir, and welcome.
Having secured our quarters and taken some hurried refreshment, we set forth accompanied by Lestrade and by a surly ostler who knew the marshes to view the scene of the supposed mishap.
It was a desolate prospect that met our eyes as we left the last hedgerow and passed out upon the fen.
On either side lay a waste of dark water and grey, sodden grass broken by clumps of reeds that whispered and hissed in the wind.
Narrow causeways of firmer ground wound among these treacherous pools, and here and there the black mouths of deeper pits showed where peat had been cut in former days.
In the distance we could see the skeleton framework of some pumping machinery and the line of a new embankment upon which the labourers had been engaged.
It was along this path that the missing navvy is supposed to have passed on the night he was last seen. The men say he had been drinking and went out to look at the pumps, and that he never came back.
I observed 2 sets of footprints leading from the village, and a single set returning.
Holmes had paused, and stooping was examining the ground with that absorbed attention which I had seen him bring to bear upon more than one apparently trivial trace.
The double track is of 2 men of nearly equal weight, though one walks with a slightly shorter stride and presses more heavily upon the left foot. The returning track is of the same boots, but the left foot now sinks less deeply than the right.
I stared at the faint marks upon the spongy soil, seeing in them only a confusion of half-obliterated impressions, but to Holmes they were already beginning to tell their tale.
You think there was foul play here, then?
I think there was a change in the gait of one of these men between his going out and his coming in, and such changes do not occur without cause.
We followed the track until it terminated upon the very verge of a wide, black pool whose surface lay still and glassy under the grey sky. Here the ground was scored and trampled as though some heavy object had been dragged to the brink and thrust into the water.
You perceive, Watson, the long sliding mark there and the deeper indentation at the end. Something of weight was drawn thus far and then allowed to drop.
A log of timber, perhaps, for there is plenty of that about the works.
Possibly, yet I am inclined to think of a burden of another and more gassy kind.
Holmes took from his pocket a small measuring tape, and after taking certain bearings from a distant clump of willows and from the faint outline of the church tower at Tilford, he paced the distance from these fixed points to the pool, making notes in his inevitable pocketbook.
It is well to be precise, for the fen is a shifting thing, and a landmark today may be a mere patch of ooze tomorrow.
The ostler, whose name was Briggs, showed us where the pumping machinery stood and the line of the new cut which was to carry the waters of the fen into a distant river, but Holmes's interest had centred itself upon that sombre pool with its trampled margin.
If there is a body there, Mr. Holmes, it will be the work of the county men with ropes and grapnels to bring it out.
In due season, Lestrade, in due season. For the moment, we have to make the acquaintance of Mr. John Wilcox and to learn how he accounts for the sudden flight of his friend and partner.
We retraced our steps to the village and were shown by the landlord into a private room where a man sat at a littered table with maps and papers spread before him.
He was of middle height, spare and dark, with a sallow skin and deep lines about the mouth, and there was in his expression a curious mingling of nervousness and hardness which struck me at once as significant.
You are from London, I think, and upon the business which has so unfortunately arisen at Blackmere.
That is so, Mr. Wilcox, and I am glad that you take so serious a view of it.
I am responsible to my firm for the proper conduct of these works, Inspector, and any scandal would be deeply injurious to me.
You are fortunate then in having had your principal associate removed at so opportune a moment.
Removed? You speak as if I had desired Forbes to go.
You informed Miss Reed that he had left England suddenly and that you could add nothing to the explanation contained in the phonographic message which reached her.
That is the simple truth. He told me that he was sick of the whole business and that he meant to try his fortune abroad, and I saw no reason to doubt him.
When did he tell you this?
A fortnight ago, on the evening before he went away.
And yet the local gossip is full of the disappearance of one of your workmen on the same night.
The fellow was drunk, Mr. Holmes, and these fens are not the place for a tipsy man after dark. I cannot be held responsible for every 12-upper who chooses to drown himself.
The words were harsh, and there was a little quiver of the nostril as he uttered them which did not escape Holmes's attention.
Your sympathies are for your own class, I perceive, but you will understand that the law inquires with equal interest into the taking off of navvy and gentlemen. Tell me, did Forbes leave this house openly in the presence of the servants and drive to the station in the usual way?
He left it openly enough, but he walked to the station, saying that the air would do him good. The ostler can bear you out that he passed the yard about 9 o'clock.
You did not accompany him.
I had my accounts to make up and remained here.
And yet the landlord tells us that a gentleman wearing Forbes's coat and hat returned some hours later and supped alone before retiring.
That is impossible, for Forbes was by that time well upon his way to London.
You are sure that he took the late train?
He told me that he would, and I sent a note by him to our city office which was delivered next day.
How do you know that it was delivered?
I had their acknowledgment by post.
With Forbes's signature?
With his initials, certainly.
Holmes had sunk into a chair and sat with his long legs thrust out and his gaze fixed upon the ceiling, a sure sign that his mind was working at its highest pitch.
You will have no objection, Mr. Wilcox, if we test for ourselves the accuracy of some of these statements.
I have nothing to conceal, Mr. Holmes, and you are at liberty to make any inquiries you please.
There was a sharp, defiant ring in his voice which betrayed more than his words.
It was plain to me that, whether guilty or innocent, this man was in a state of great mental tension.
That afternoon and evening was spent in taking the evidence of the landlord, the servants, and the ostler, and in each case the story fitted with a curious exactness into that which Holmes had already pieced together from his examination of the tracks upon the fen. The ostler swore that he had seen Mr. Forbes and Mr. Wilcox go out together about 8 o'clock along the path to the pumps, that he had later heard voices raised as an altercation from the direction of the marsh, and that about 10 o'clock a single figure in Mr. Forbes's overcoat and hat had passed the yard, its boots heavy with mud, and had entered the inn. The landlord and the maid confirmed that this solitary guest had supped in silence, scarce raising his face, and had gone early to his room. None had seen him depart in the morning, for he had left before the house was astir. As we sat later in our chamber with the wind moaning round the corners of the old inn and the smell of damp earth in our nostrils, Holmes desired that the phonograph should again be set in motion.
I wish you, Watson, to listen not with your ears but with your memory. Shut your eyes and recall the tones of Wilcox as we have heard them today, his manner, his choice of words, his very pauses, and then mark how much of him there is in this supposed utterance of Forbes.
I followed his injunction, and as the thin voice once more tinkled through its short message, I could not but acknowledge that there were indeed certain resemblances which I had not previously appreciated. The same gloomy turn of phrase, the same formal expressions, where a woman nature would have broken through in spite of itself, above all a certain deliberate slowness, which was not that of hesitation, but of one who measures each word.
You perceive it now, do you not?
I confess that I do, and I am persuaded that no lover speaking for the last time to the woman he has wronged would have used such phrases.
Exactly. Add to that the fact that Our Lady recognises some of the sentences as almost literal repetitions of phrases which Wilcox has employed in her hearing, and the case grows clearer.
You are then convinced that Forbes has not spoken these words?
I am convinced that the vox apri nihil, which we have just heard, is but the ghost of his voice summoned by a very clumsy necromancer. Our next step is to trace the result of the supposed journey to London and see what figure it was which acted as Forbes in the transaction of business.
It was arranged, therefore, that on the following day we should leave Lestrade to set in motion the necessary measures for the examination of the pool upon the Fen, while Holmes and I returned to town to call upon the lodging-house in Bloomsbury and upon the city firm connected with the Blackmere scheme. Before we left, however, Holmes requested one more interview with Wilcox.
I understand, Mr. Wilcox, that you're acquainted with the use of the phonograph.
I know as much as any man who has had one of the machines in his keeping for some months.
You have listened often to the cylinders which your friend dictated.
Naturally, since it was my task to see that his rough notes were afterwards transcribed.
You would, therefore, have had every opportunity of studying his accent, his intonations, and those small peculiarities which distinguish one voice from another.
I fail to see your drift, Mr. Holmes.
My drift will become apparent when the Fen yields up its secret, Mr. Wilcox, and when we have compared certain signatures in London.
A sudden ashen pallor overspread the man's face, and for an instant his fingers twitched upon the table, but he recovered himself with a great effort.
I have nothing to fear from any inquiry, and you will find that all is in order.
Holmes made no reply to this, but his eyes were very bright as we took our leave. The journey back to London passed for the most part in silence, each of us occupied with his own reflections, and it was late in the afternoon when we found ourselves standing before the sober brick frontage of the lodging-house in Bloomsbury, which Miss Reed had indicated. The door was opened by a stout, good-natured woman with an apron tucked up about her ample person.
Rooms to let, gentlemen, if that is your business, and very respectable they are.
Our business, madam, is with a former lodger of yours who took a room here some 10 days since under the name of Forbes.
Ah, the gentleman who stayed but one night and was so very particular about his fire being kept in and his boots cleaned early. I remember him well enough.
You will do us a service if you will tell us what you can of his appearance and movements.
He came late in the afternoon with a small bag and said he would be leaving by an early train. He was a dark gentleman with a close beard, and his voice was hoarse, as if with a cold, so that he spoke lower than common. There was a young lady with him for a few minutes, very agitated she seemed, but he said she was mistaken in him and he would not have her make a scene at my door.
This, as we could not but recognise, was poor Miss Reed's attempt to force an explanation from the man whom she believed to be her lover.
Did you hear the name by which the lady addressed him?
She called him Alistair, sir, and he turned quite white when he heard it.
Did you observe anything in his manner of walking or standing which struck you?
Well, now you speak of it, he favoured his left leg a little, as if he had strained it, and he stood very stiff and straight when he thought any one was looking at him.
You had no other occasion to see him?
Only when he went out in the evening and when he left at daybreak, for I was up early that morning with the sweep.
You are sure that he left alone?
I am certain of it, sir, for I watched him from the window till he turned the corner, and there was no one with him.
You have done us a service and may hear more of this matter in due course.
From the lodging-house we made our way to the offices of Messrs. Fordyce and Latham, the engineers who held the concession of the Blackmere drainage. There we were received by a florid gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Latham, and who stared in some perplexity when Holmes broached the subject of Forbes's supposed departure.
I am not aware that Mr. Forbes has left our employment, sir, though he has certainly been strangely remiss in sending in his reports of late.
You have, however, received from him certain documents executed in London a few days since.
We have received an authority over his signature permitting Mr. John Wilcox to act for him in some minor matters connected with the transfer of lands, but nothing beyond that.
You have that document?
It is filed with our papers, but I can have it brought.
The clerk who was sent returned with a neat packet from which Mr. Latham selected a folded sheet and handed it to Holmes.
I watched my friend closely as he studied the bold initials at the bottom.
You have letters undoubtedly written by Mr. Forbes.
A number of them dealing with the progress of the works and the financial position.
Pray allow me to compare them.
He laid the authority beside two of the letters, and for some minutes there was no sound in the room save the ticking of a clock, while his keen eyes passed to and fro.
The resemblance is striking, yet there are differences which would be more apparent to a compositor than to a layman. The man who wrote this authority letter has gone to great pains to imitate the hand of Forbes, and he has succeeded so far as general effect goes, but when you examine the junctions of the strokes you perceive that the habitual movement of the muscles is not the same.
Mr. Latham stared in some alarm from Holmes to the paper.
Do you mean that we have been tricked and that this authority is a forgery?
I mean that I would not stake much upon its standing as searching cross-examination in a court of law. You will oblige me, Mr. Latham, by preserving all these documents carefully, for they may be of vital importance before the matter is ended.
Having thus sown a seed of disquiet in the city office, Holmes announced that we had seen enough in London for the moment, and that our place was once more upon the edge of the fen. The next day found us again in Tilford, where Lestrade met us with a face which told its own tale.
Your instincts have not deceived you, Mr. Holmes, for we have drawn a body from the pool and there is little doubt whose it is.
A chill ran through me at this confirmation of our darkest surmise, and even Holmes's iron composure was for an instant shaken.
You have examined it.
So far as the condition permits, for it has lain in the water for some days. There is a wound upon the head which might have been caused by a blow from a heavy staff, and there were marks upon the wrist where some sort of chain or rope had been fastened. The clothes and the contents of the pockets leave no doubt that it is the body of Mr. Alistair Forbes.
Then the fen has rendered up its secret sooner than I had expected. Where is the body now?
In an outhouse behind the inn, and the local doctor has done what he can in the way of an examination.
We asked to be taken to the place, and I shall not readily forget the grim sight which met our eyes when the coarse canvas was drawn back. Though swollen and discoloured by its sojourn in the water, the features were still sufficiently preserved for me to recognise the man whose photograph Miss Reed had shown us, and whose voice we had heard upon the cylinder. The right side of the skull was bruised and broken, and upon the left wrist there were raw marks, as if some metal band had bitten into the flesh.
You perceive, Watson, that our sliding mark and deeper indentation at the fen side are now explained.
Holmes stooped and with his finger traced cautiously the livid ring upon the dead man's arm.
The surveyor's chained Lestrade. I observed that Wilcox wore such an instrument at his belt when we saw him last.
I recall it now that you mention it. You will say next that it was with this chain that he dragged the body to the pool?
I shall say nothing until the man himself has been confronted with the facts and has had the opportunity to furnish some more innocent explanation.
The opportunity was not long delayed, for upon our return to the inn, we found Mr. John Wilcox in the parlour, his papers spread before him, but lying neglected while he stared with bloodshot eyes into the empty grate.
So the rumour runs that you have found a body.
The rumour is correct, and the body is that of your late associate, Mr. Alistair Forbes.
It is a lie. Forbes is in America by this time.
So the phonograph would have us believe, yet the fen has a voice of its own, which contradicts the machine.
Holmes's tone was very quiet, but there was in his grey eyes a steely light which I had learned to associate with the moment when he felt that he held his adversary at his mercy.
The law, Mr. Wilcox, is indulgent to those who, under sudden provocation, commit a desperate act, but it is not indulgent to those who add to the act the baseness of deliberate deception and forgery.
What do you mean?
I mean that you will do well to tell us here, and now in what manner you lured your friend to the pool upon the fen, felled him with your staff, fastened the surveyor's chain about his wrist, and dragged him to the water's edge, there to sink him in the black peat, trusting that his disappearance would be laid to drink or accident.
The man sprang to his feet,
his face livid and his hands clutching at the air, but no sound came from his dry throat.
I mean further that, having rid yourself thus of the one man who stood between you and both a coveted woman and a profitable share in this enterprise, you conceived the notable idea of assuming his identity for one night in London. You came back from the Fen wearing his coat and hat, supped alone, and in the early morning took the train as Forbes, signing papers in his name, and lodging for a few hours with the landlady who noted your hoarse voice and your limp upon the left leg, the very opposite of the old army injury, which had left Forbes lame upon the right.
A strangled cry burst at last from Wilcox's lips.
It was fortune that gave me his figure and something of his features, but it was my own labour that taught me his tones.
The confession had broken from him unawares, and he stared at us with the dull amazement of one who has betrayed himself.
Then you admit that you personated Forbes?
I admit nothing that can hang me, but I tell you that I loved Margaret Reed before ever Forbes set eyes upon her. I saw her preference turn to him, and I watched him step into the place that should have been mine, with his easy laugh and his careless ways, and I swore that if chance and courage served me I would have both his fortune and his bride.
You chose a strange road by which to court a lady's favour.
I meant at first only to frighten him, to shake his nerve, to make him seem weak and untrustworthy in her eyes. It was I who urged upon him the use of the phonograph and who listened to every word that he spoke into the horn, teaching myself his inflections until I could mimic him so closely that even your clever ears were deceived for a moment.
You overrate my ears, but proceed.
On that last night upon the Fen we walked together to the pumps, and I told him that the city firm had resolved to curtail his interest and that he would have little from the scheme. He grew furious, for he was hot-blooded, and he said that he would quarrel with them and with me, and that he would take Miss Reed from me as well. Then the devil in me answered his devil, and we closed, struggling upon the narrow track above the pit. I struck at him with the staff, hardly knowing that I did it, and he fell and lay still.
The man passed his hand across his brow as if that dreadful scene were again before him.
I knew that if he were found there with my stick beside him, no court in England would believe that it was accident, so I fastened the chain to his wrist and dragged him to the pool, and when the black water closed over him I felt that I had buried my own ruin.
You then returned to the inn, ate, slept, and the next morning went up to London as if nothing had occurred.
I had resolved to secure the land transfer in our joint names and then to vanish abroad, leaving the world to suppose that Forbes had played the coward and had deserted the lady whom he had promised to marry. The phonograph gave me the means to complete the illusion. I spoke in his manner, using phrases he had used, and I sent the cylinder to her, thinking that the machine would carry more conviction than any letter in which she might fancy she detected a difference.
You miscalculated the delicacy of a woman's ear, Mr. Wilcox, and you forgot that the most cunning forger of voices or of signatures will always leave behind some betraying stroke.
You have heard enough, Mr. Holmes, and so have I. John Wilkes, I arrest you on the charge of wilful murder and of forging documents with intent to defraud.
Lestrade stepped forward, his hand outstretched, but Wilcox made no resistance.
He sank again into his chair, his face grey and drawn, and sat staring before him, while the officer repeated the familiar formula of the law.
You will be required to make your statement again before the magistrates, and I warn you that anything you have said may be used against you.
I have said enough, and more than enough. If the Fen had kept its secret I might have prospered, but since it has spoken, let it speak the whole.
Thus ended the confession of John Wilcox, and I need not dwell upon the subsequent legal proceedings which followed their orderly course. He was committed, tried at the next assizes, and in due season paid with his life for the life that he had taken. As for Miss Margaret Reed, she bore herself with a quiet fortitude which moved even the hard-faced men in the court, and when, after the verdict, Holmes and I waited upon her to tell her all that we had discovered, she received the disclosure with a composure which showed that the worst had already been faced in her own brave heart.
It is better so, Dr. Watson, for I know now that the man I loved died in honour, and not in shame. I shall remember him as he was before envy and hatred rose about us, and I shall not repine that our happiness was cut short, since it might have been poisoned by suspicion and misrepresentation.
You have suffered much, Miss Reed. but you have at least the consolation of knowing that no shadow rests upon his name. Time and your own strong nature will do the rest.
Some months later, I heard that she had accepted a modest provision from the city firm as a recognition of the service which Forbes had rendered them, and that she had taken charge of a small school in a distant county where, as Holmes remarked, she might find healing in useful labour. The Blackmere scheme passed into other hands, and the fen, which had so nearly swallowed up the traces of a great crime, was by degrees tamed and parcelled out into honest fields and gardens.
Yet for me, whenever I see a stretch of dark water among reeds, or hear the low whisper of wind over marshland, there rises before my mind the image of that still pool under the grey sky, and of the grim burden which withdrew from its depths.
It was upon an evening, some time after the execution of Wilcox, that I sat once more in our old armchair in Baker Street, my notes upon the case spread before me, while Holmes, with his pipe between his lips, leaned back amid a haze of smoke and listened to my comments. I had laid particular stress upon the part played by the phonograph in the matter, and upon the ease with which so simple a device might be turned to criminal uses. Holmes smiled lazily as I concluded.
You are inclined, Watson, to blame the instrument rather than the hand that wielded it.
Surely you must allow that the new inventions plied a temptation and a weapon which might not otherwise have been within a villain's reach.
The temptation, my dear fellow, lay in the heart of Wilcox, and not in the works of brass and wax upon the table. The machine did but repeat the sounds that were fed to it, as unthinking a servant as the pen which wrote his forged authority, or the chain which dragged his victim to the pool. What interests me is not the mechanism, but the psychological fact that he trusted more to an artificial semblance of his enemy's voice than to his own power of dissimulation face to face.
He had reason to fear the scrutiny of those who knew Forbes well.
Precisely. A woman who has listened 100 times to a man's words will detect a false no, which no stranger could perceive, and so it was that the one person against whom the device was aimed was the very person who pierced its disguise. It is a useful reminder, Watson, that while science may furnish the criminal with fresh tools, it also furnishes us with new tests, and that in the last resort the human heart and the human memory are instruments more delicate than any contrivance of the laboratory.
You would say then that the case is memorable less for the mechanical trick than for the psychology which lay behind it.
I would say that it is memorable as an instance of jealousy working upon a narrow nature and seeking to cloak itself in the externals of honour and progress. The fen, the chain, and the phonograph were but the stage, the rope, and the footlights, while the true drama was played within the breast of John Wilcox.
Holmes relapsed into silence, and I, gathering up my notes, felt once more that sense of admiration, not untinged with awe, with which I had come so often to regard the workings of his singular mind. The case of the Blackmere phonograph, as I have ventured to call it, remained among those which were too intimate and too charged with personal sorrow to be given to the world in cold print during the lives of those most nearly touched by it.
Now that time has thrown its softening veil over the events and the actors alike, I have set it down in the hope that it may add one more illustration of the marvellous powers of observation and deduction, which made my friend the first consulting detective in Europe.
And now, my dear listener, since you have borne me company through this somewhat sombre chronicle, let me thank you most sincerely for having remained with me to its close.
If the adventures of Sherlock Holmes and your humble servant have afforded you some little interest or diversion, I would beg you to signify it by such tokens of favour as are in your power, by marking your approval, by subscribing to this channel, and by letting fall a word or two in the way of comment.
You will observe in the lower right-hand corner of your screen a small code, and in the description, beneath this story, a modest link, by either of which any mark of support to the continued existence of these readings will be received with heartfelt gratitude.
In that same description you will find also certain further paths of exploration, leading you to other tales which belong to quite distinct series and moods, should you desire a change of scene, while still remaining beneath the same hospitable roof.
For the present I bid you a very cordial farewell, and I trust that when next some untold case of Sherlock Holmes is laid upon the table, you will once again favour us with your company.